Hello everyone. My name is Raven McLeod, and I'm 32 years old now, though the story I'm about to tell you happened just a couple of years ago, when I was 30. It's funny, isn't it, how certain moments can feel like they happened yesterday, especially when they involve family and those little stinging remarks that burrow under your skin? I'm a publishing executive, and I've built a career I'm incredibly proud of, brick by painstaking brick. But for the longest time, to my own mother, I was just, well, still trying to make it in books. Imagine being at your mother's meticulously arranged book club, surrounded by her friends, all polite smiles and expensive tea, and hearing her introduce you, her grown-up, accomplished daughter, with that exact phrase. And then, imagine the sheer, delicious irony when the very bestseller they're all fawning over, the book that's on everyone's lips, turns out to be your discovery, your project, your triumph. What would you do in that moment? How would you feel, knowing you held the truth that could change their entire perception of you? Before we dive into that particular afternoon tea and tension scenario, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And hey, if you've ever felt that sharp pang of being underestimated, especially by family, or had to fight twice as hard to prove your worth, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want to hear more stories about standing up for yourself and finding your own way, please consider subscribing. It means the world to know there are people out there who understand these journeys. My childhood was, in many ways, idyllic, at least on the surface. We lived in a comfortable suburban house, picket fence and all. My father was, and is, a quiet, kind man, an engineer who found solace in diagrams and certainties. My mother, Eleanor, however, was different. She was the social architect of the family, deeply invested in appearances, in what the neighbors thought, in the subtle hierarchies of local society. Books were my escape from a very young age. While other kids were outside playing tag, I was devouring stories, lost in other worlds, fascinated by the power of words to create and transport. My mother, bless her heart, saw this as a quaint hobby. "Isn't that nice, dear?" she'd say, a distant smile on her face as she bustled off to a committee meeting or a garden party. She never quite discouraged it, not actively, but she certainly never encouraged it as a viable future. The seeds of conflict, or perhaps more accurately, the seeds of her misunderstanding, were sown early. When I talked about wanting to work with books, to make books, her brow would furrow. "But what kind of a job is that, Raven? It's not very secure, is it? Not like being a doctor or a lawyer. Your cousin Amanda is going into law, you know." Such a sensible girl. Amanda, always Amanda. Or Penelope, whose father was a judge. Or Sophie, who was pre-med. The comparisons were constant, subtle at first, then more overt as I got older, and my path diverged further from her expectations. It wasn't malicious, I don't think. Or maybe it was, in a passively aggressive, I know best kind of way. It was more like she had a script for my life, and I was stubbornly ad-libbing my scenes with characters she didn't recognize. My passion for literature, for the intricate dance of storytelling and the thrill of discovering new voices, was something she filed under Raven's little eccentricities. She couldn't see the ambition in it, the drive, the sheer hard work it would entail. To her, it was less a career and more a prolonged childhood fantasy I was stubbornly refusing to outgrow. The catalyst for the whole book club debacle wasn't a sudden explosion, but more like the slow, inexorable tightening of a screw, a pressure that had been building for years. It was a Tuesday afternoon, I remember, because I was neck-deep in quarterly reports, trying to make sense of sales figures and marketing spends. My direct line rang, and caller ID showed Mom. I braced myself. Our conversations had a predictable pattern, a brief, perfunctory inquiry about my well-being, followed by a lengthy monologue about her social engagements, her friends, her garden, and then, invariably, a subtle dig at my life choices, usually wrapped in a compliment for someone else's child. "Raven, darling, how are you?" she began, her voice bright and brittle. "I'm good, Mom, busy. We just had a big launch last week, and it's looking promising." I tried to inject some enthusiasm, a hint of my professional reality. "Oh, that's nice," she said, the word nice doing its usual heavy lifting of conveying complete disinterest. "Listen, dear, my book club is meeting here next Thursday. The girls are so keen to finally meet you properly. You know, they hear me talk about you. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Her book club, a collection of her closest friends, women whose approval she craved, women who, I suspected, received a carefully curated version of my life story. Oh, Mom, Thursday is really difficult. We have a major acquisitions meeting. Nonsense, Raven. It's in the afternoon. Surely you can spare a couple of hours for your mother. Besides, she added, her voice taking on that slightly wheedling tone I knew so well, we're discussing that marvelous new bestseller, The Obsidian Compass. Everyone is raving about it. I thought you, being in the, book world, might find it interesting. Perhaps pick up a few tips on what sells. Pick up a few tips, as if I were a novice, a hobbyist looking for pointers. The irony was so thick I could have spread it on toast. The Obsidian Compass, by Elias Thorne, was not just a book I had read, it was a book I had lived and breathed for the past 18 months. It was my discovery, my author, my triumph. The author, a reclusive genius, was someone I had personally coaxed out of obscurity. But she didn't know that, how could she? She never asked about specifics. Mom, I started, trying to keep my voice even. That book, The Obsidian Compass, I actually know a bit about it. My company publishes it. There was a slight pause. Oh, do they, dear? Well, isn't that a coincidence? See, you'll have something to contribute then. Just a little something. It's all very complicated, that business, isn't it? Not like being a famous author yourself, of course, but still. Dismissal, wrapped in a veneer of faint praise. The familiar ache settled in my chest. It was the casualness of her undermining that always got to me. The way she could, with a single inflection, reduce my entire career to a footnote. That phone call, her breezy ignorance, her almost willful refusal to see me as anything other than her perpetual work-in-progress daughter, that was the catalyst. It wasn't a single dramatic act of injustice, but the culmination of years of these small, paper-cut dismissals. I felt a surge of something. Not anger exactly, more like a weary exasperation mixed with a sudden, sharp desire to not be invisible anymore, to not have my achievements so effortlessly minimized. My initial emotional reaction was a familiar cocktail of frustration and a deep, aching sadness. I hung up the phone and stared blankly at my computer screen, the sales figures blurring into meaningless squiggles. Why did it still bother me so much? I was a grown woman, a successful professional. I had a team that respected me, authors who trusted me, a reputation in an incredibly tough industry. Yet, a few careless words from my mother could unravel me, just like that. It was the feeling of being fundamentally unseen by the one person whose validation, however much I tried to deny it, still held a certain primal power. The despair wasn't a loud, wailing grief, but a quiet, internal hollowness. The thought of attending that book club, of sitting there while my mother painted me as some sort of well-meaning amateur, filled me with a weary dread. It felt like walking willingly into an ambush I knew was coming. Her justifications, if you could call them that, were always the same. She'd rationalize her dismissiveness by framing it as concern. I just want you to be happy, Raven, and it seems like such a struggle for you. Or she'd imply my chosen field was somehow beneath my potential. You were always so bright, dear. I just imagined something more for you. More tangible, more easily bragged about at dinner parties. Her friends' daughters were doctors, lawyers, marrying well, producing grandchildren. I was in books. It was vague, unimpressive in her social currency. If I ever tried to explain the complexities of my role, negotiating contracts, strategic marketing, editorial development, the thrill of discovering a new voice, her eyes would glaze over. Yes, dear, that all sounds very creative, she'd say, before deftly changing the subject to something more relatable to her world, like Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses, or the upcoming charity gala. It was a masterclass in polite deflection, in ensuring my reality never quite punctured her carefully constructed narrative. Despite the constant low hum of my mother's disapproval, or perhaps because of it, a quiet vow had taken root in me years ago. It wasn't a dramatic fist-shaking at the sky moment, but a steady internal resolve. I would succeed. I would build a career on my own terms, fueled by my genuine passion, not by her narrow definition of success. Every time she'd make a dismissive comment, every time she'd compare me unfavorably to one of her friend's more sensible daughters, it was like adding another small log to that internal fire. My decision to go to that book club, despite every instinct screaming at me to feign a sudden illness, felt like part of that vow. It wasn't about seeking her approval anymore. I think I'd subconsciously given up on that. It was about presence. About not letting her narrative be the only one in the room even if I didn't say a word. It was about facing that discomfort head-on, a small act of defiance against the years of feeling minimized. The path to becoming a publishing executive hadn't been paved with rose petals, believe me. It was a grueling climb. The early years were a blur of late nights and early mornings, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the desperate hope of finding that one manuscript, that one voice that would make it all worthwhile. I started as an editorial assistant, a glorified gopher, really. My tiny apartment was crammed with manuscripts, towering, teetering piles of them, and my social life was practically non-existent. The pay was abysmal. I remember living on instant noodles and dreams, carefully budgeting every penny. There were moments of profound self-doubt, times when my mother's voice would echo in my head. "Are you sure about this, Raven?" It's such a struggle. I'd push it away, bury myself deeper in the slush pile, searching, always searching. There was the time I championed a debut novel I adored, only to have it tank spectacularly, selling less than 500 copies after we'd poured our hearts and a considerable budget into it. The author was devastated, the sales team was disappointed, and I felt like a personal failure. Then there was the author who turned out to be a diva of epic proportions, demanding, unreasonable, making everyone's life a misery. I had to learn to be tough, to negotiate, to say no, to manage egos bigger than my apartment. There were endless meetings, budget battles, marketing brainstorms that went nowhere, and the constant pressure to find the next big thing. It was relentless, exhausting, and utterly exhilarating when things went right. Each small success, a manuscript acquired, a positive review, a book hitting a regional bestseller list, was a hard-won victory. But I wasn't entirely alone on this journey. My lifeline in those early, lean years was my friend Chloe. We'd met in a dingy intern orientation program at different publishing houses, two bright-eyed idealists ready to conquer the literary world. Chloe was pragmatic, hilariously cynical, and fiercely loyal. She understood the madness, the passion, the absurdities of our chosen profession. Many nights we'd debrief over cheap wine, dissecting our days, complaining about our bosses, and dreaming about the books we'd one day publish. "Your mom just doesn't get it, Rav," Chloe would say, swirling her wine. "She thinks books magically appear on shelves. She has no idea you're basically a literary midwife, wrestling these things into existence." Her validation was a balm to my often bruised ego. Then there was Mr. Henderson, my first real boss, a grizzled, old-school editor with a gruff exterior and a heart of gold. He saw something in me, some spark of talent or tenacity, and took me under his wing. He taught me the nuts and bolts of editing, the art of the deal, how to spot potential in a rough manuscript. "You've got good instincts, McLeod," he'd grumble, handing me a manuscript scrawled with his almost illegible notes. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He was the antithesis of my mother. He didn't care about appearances, only about the quality of the work. His gruff approval meant more to me than 1,000 polite compliments from my mother's friends. And later, there was Ben, my partner, a software developer who found my world of books endlessly fascinating, if a little bewildering. He'd listen patiently to my rants about difficult authors or disastrous cover designs, offer unwavering support, and, most importantly, celebrate my victories. No matter how small they seemed to the outside world, he'd read the books I published, talk about them intelligently, and tell me he was proud of me. Simple words, but they built a fortress around my often shaky confidence. The contrast between this genuine support system and my mother's attitude was stark. While I was wrestling with contract negotiations or agonizing over an author's delicate prose, my mother would call to tell me about Daphne's daughter, Melissa, who had just made partner at her law firm. Such a prestigious position, Raven, and her mother is just bursting with pride, of course. Or, young Dr. Albright, you remember him? His son just won a research grant. So clever. Medicine is such a noble profession, isn't it? It was never direct criticism of me, always this implied comparison, this gentle underscoring of how my achievements, whatever they were, didn't quite measure up on her scale of impressiveness. Her friends' daughters were quantifiable successes. I was still this nebulous trying to make it in books. It was as if my world was printed in a font she couldn't or wouldn't read. This persistent, subtle invalidation was the backdrop against which I built my career, a constant, low-grade static that I learned to tune out, most of the time. But sometimes, like before that book club meeting, the static would get louder, harder to ignore. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to carve out my niche in the publishing world. From editorial assistant, I moved up to assistant editor, then editor. Each step was a battle, a testament to late nights, endless reading, and a stubborn refusal to give up. I started to build a list of authors, to develop a reputation for having a good eye, for being an editor who wasn't afraid to take risks. I remember the thrill of my first acquisition that actually made a splash, a quirky, beautifully written novel by an unknown writer that a senior editor had dismissed as too niche. I fought for it, and it found its audience, even winning a minor literary award. My mother's reaction? "Oh, that's nice, dear. Did I tell you Penelope is engaged? Such a lovely young man, a cardiologist." One of my proudest achievements, before the Obsidian Compass exploded, was a historical fiction series I'd nurtured. The author was a meticulous researcher but a hesitant storyteller. We worked for years, shaping the narrative, deepening the characters. When the first book hit the extended New York Times bestseller list, I called my mother, practically bursting with excitement. "That's wonderful, Raven," she'd said. "Are you getting enough sleep? You sound a bit tired, you know, Mrs. Albright was saying her daughter takes these wonderful vitamin supplements." It was like trying to share a vibrant Technicolor dream with someone who could only see in shades of gray. The real turning point, the project that would unknowingly set the stage for that fateful book club meeting, began with a battered manuscript that landed on my desk. It was unsolicited, arriving in the dreaded slush pile, a mountain of hopefuls that most editors barely glanced at. But something about the query letter, a certain quiet confidence in the prose, made me pause. The manuscript was titled The Obsidian Compass, and the author was a Mr. Prout. Elias Thorne, a name I didn't recognize. I took it home that weekend, more out of a sense of duty than real expectation. From the first page, I was utterly captivated. It was a breathtakingly original story, a blend of historical mystery, philosophical inquiry, and heart-stopping adventure. The writing was sublime, the characters unforgettable. I stayed up all night reading, coffee growing cold beside me, the city silent outside my window. By dawn, I knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in my bones, that this was something special. This was the kind of book I'd gotten into publishing to find. Convincing my colleagues took some doing. Elias Thorne had no track record, no agent, and the manuscript was long and complex, but Mr. Ed J. I. Henderson, now semi-retired but still a voice of influence, read it at my urging and simply said, "MacLeod, if you don't publish this, you're a fool." That was all the backing I needed. Getting in touch with Elias Thorne was another adventure. He was a recluse, living in a remote part of the country, communicating mainly through terse emails. But he was also brilliant, and surprisingly open to editorial suggestions once he trusted me. The editing process was intense, exhilarating. We polished, we tweaked, we debated commas and character arcs. My team and I then threw ourselves into crafting the perfect launch strategy, from the cover design to the marketing campaign. We knew we had something extraordinary, but the market is fickle. As the Obsidian Compass began its ascent, from whispers in the industry to rave reviews to word-of-mouth phenomenon, I tried, cautiously, to share this with my mother. "Mom, that book I was telling you about, by Elias Thorne, it's really taking off. We're getting incredible press." "Oh, Elias Thorne?" she'd replied, a vague recognition in her voice. "Is he one of those handsome young authors? I saw a picture of someone rather dashing in the paper the other day." "Good for him. Are you remembering to eat properly, Raven? You work too hard." She never connected my intense work with the book's success. It was as if Elias Thorne, this literary sensation, had sprung fully formed into the world, and I was merely an incidental observer, still trying to make it in the background. Her continued dismissal, even as the Obsidian Compass became a cultural touchstone, was baffling, frustrating, and if I'm honest, deeply hurtful. She was an avid reader, a member of a book club, for heaven's sake. How could she be so oblivious? Or was it willful ignorance? A refusal to acknowledge that her daughter, the one still trying, might actually be a significant player in this world she claimed to appreciate? There was one tiny, almost imperceptible shift in the family dynamic around that time, though. My Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, had always been a bit more bohemian, a bit more open-minded than Eleanor. She lived in another state, but we kept in touch. One day she called me, her voice fizzing with excitement. "Raven, I just finished The Obsidian Compass. My God, what a book." And then I saw an article online, something about the publisher, and it mentioned your house, and then I dug a bit deeper. "Raven, did you have something to do with this masterpiece?" When I confirmed that yes, I was indeed Elias Thorne's editor and publisher, she shrieked with delight. "I knew it. I always knew you had that special spark, even when Eleanor was... well, you know Eleanor. Oh, I am so incredibly proud of you, sweetie. You have to tell me everything." Her genuine enthusiasm, her unreserved pride, was like a cool drink of water in a desert. It was a small thing, a conversation with a distant aunt, but it meant the world. It was a reminder that not everyone saw me through my mother's diminishing lens. It was a tiny crack of light in the otherwise solid wall of familial incomprehension. And so, the stage was set. My mother, armed with her helpful invitation and her profound misunderstanding of my life, was about to host her book club. The topic of discussion: The Obsidian Compass. The special guest, her daughter, Raven, who was still trying to make it in books. I remember checking my reflection before I left for her house that Thursday. I looked calm, professional. Inside, though, I was a churning mix of resignation and a strange, nascent flicker of anticipation. It felt like walking onto a stage for a play where I knew my lines, but the rest of the cast was working from a completely different script. The air was thick with the scent of impending irony. I took a deep breath. Showtime. My mother's house was immaculate as always. Sunlight streamed through the perfectly polished windows of the living room, glinting off the silver tea service and the delicate porcelain cups arranged on the lace-covered coffee table. The scent of freshly baked scones and Earl Grey tea hung in the air, a fragrant armor against any potential unpleasantness. The girls, as my mother affectionately called her book club members, a formidable assembly of impeccably coiffed women in their late 50s and 60s, were already gathered, their chatter a low, polite hum. There was Mrs. Albright, whose son, the brilliant doctor, was a constant, unspoken rebuke to my own career. There was Mrs. Henderson, not related to my old boss, but a woman whose pronouncements on literature were treated as gospel. And several others, whose names and faces blurred into a general impression of pearl necklaces and polite scrutiny. My mother greeted me at the door with a kiss that brushed my cheek, her eyes already scanning me for any perceived flaws. "Raven, darling, you made it. Come in, come in. Girls, this is my daughter, Raven." She led me into the lioness's den. I plastered on a smile that I hoped looked more genuine than it felt. "So lovely to finally meet you, dear," Mrs. Albright chirped, her eyes giving me a swift, appraising once over. "Your mother talks about you." I bet she does, I thought. My mother, beaming as if presenting a slightly exotic but ultimately harmless pet, gestured vaguely towards me. "Yes, this is Raven. She works with books," she announced, a slight hesitant emphasis on the "works with," as if it were a curious, undefined activity. Then came the kicker, delivered with a soft, indulgent laugh. "Still trying to make it in that world, you know. Such a tough business." A wave of polite, faintly pitying smiles washed over me from the assembled ladies. I saw a few exchanged glances. Oh, yes, they knew the script, the daughter with the quaint, impractical career. I just smiled back, a tight, fixed thing, and took the cup of tea offered to me. For a while, the conversation eddied around local gossip, upcoming charity events, and whose grandchild had said the cleverest thing that week. I was largely ignored, a quiet observer on the periphery, which suited me just fine. I sipped my tea and listened, the words, "still trying to make it," echoing in my head like a dull, persistent ache. Then, Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat. a signal that the official book club discussion was about to commence. "Well, ladies," she began, her voice resonant with authority, "the Obsidian Compass. What a triumph, wouldn't you agree? Elias Thorne is simply a genius." A chorus of enthusiastic agreement went around the room. Absolutely breathtaking. I couldn't put it down. The characters felt so real. They dissected the plot, debated the themes, marveled at the intricate historical detail. My mother, who I suspected had only skimmed the first 50 pages and read a synopsis online, nodded sagely at all the right moments, occasionally interjecting with a "precisely" or "so true." I listened quietly, a strange sense of detachment washing over me. It was like hearing people discuss a secret you alone possessed. They praised the intricate plotting, the lyrical prose, the profound philosophical questions the novel raised. They speculated about the mysterious Elias Thorne, his reclusive nature only adding to his mystique. "One wonders where he gets his ideas," mused Mrs. Albright. "Such a complex mind." Finally, Mrs. Henderson, perhaps remembering the guest in their midst, turned to me. "And you, Raven dear, you're in the book world, as your mother says. Have you had a chance to read The Obsidian Compass? What were your thoughts?" All eyes swiveled to me, the polite curiosity, the faint condescension, it was all there. My mother gave me a small, encouraging smile, the kind one gives a child about to recite a poem they've half forgotten. This was it, the moment. I could have mumbled something non-committal. I could have agreed politely and let the moment pass, but years of quiet frustration, of being underestimated, of my passion being trivialized, coalesced into a single point of clarity. The words, "still trying to make it," were the spark. I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the warmth of the cup, the delicate flavor. I met Mrs. Henderson's gaze, then let my eyes travel around the circle of expectant faces, landing finally on my mother, who was looking at me with a slightly anxious expression. Probably worried I was about to say something embarrassing or too niche. "Yes," I said, my voice calm even, carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room. "Yes, I've read The Obsidian Compass. It is indeed a remarkable novel. Elias Thorne is a truly gifted writer, one of the most original voices I've encountered in years." I paused, letting that sink in. Then I delivered the line I hadn't consciously prepared but which seemed to spring forth fully formed. "I know this because I'm his publisher. I found his manuscript in a slush pile when everyone else had likely overlooked it. I championed it, edited it, and my team at Viridian Books and I launched his career. The Obsidian Compass is my book." The silence that followed was absolute. It was so profound you could hear the gentle tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound I hadn't even registered before. Cups hovered halfway to lips. Polite smiles froze, then slowly dissolved into expressions of stunned disbelief. Mrs. Henderson's mouth was slightly agape. Mrs. Lashaniadius' mouth was slightly agape. Albright's perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up so high they almost disappeared into her hairline. And my mother. Oh, my mother. Her face was a kaleidoscope of emotions. First, blank confusion, as if I'd suddenly started speaking in tongues. Then, a dawning comprehension, quickly followed by a flush of crimson that started at her neck and spread rapidly upwards. Shock. Utter, unadulterated shock, mixed with a healthy dose of embarrassment. Her eyes, wide and suddenly uncertain, darted from me to her friends, then back to me. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, no sound emerging. For the first time in as long as I could remember, Eleanor MacLeod was speechless. Her carefully constructed narrative of Raven still trying to make it had just been publicly, spectacularly, and undeniable demolished. The quiet satisfaction that bloomed in my chest was warm, profound, and entirely devoid of malice. It was simply the quiet hum of truth, finally spoken aloud. The silence in the room stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then it shattered, not with an explosion, but with a sudden, excited babble of voices. You published it?" Mrs. Henderson was the first to find her voice, her tone a mixture of awe and incredulity. "You're Elias Thorne's publisher?" "But, how fascinating!" exclaimed Mrs. Albright, her earlier pity replaced by an almost fervent interest. "You discovered him?" Suddenly, I was the center of attention, not as Eleanor's daughter who dabbles in books, but as a bona fide industry player, the woman behind the biggest literary phenomenon of the year. Questions flew at me from all directions. What is he like, this Elias Thorne? Was it difficult to work with him? How did you know it would be such a success? Tell us everything. I answered their questions calmly, professionally, sharing anecdotes about the discovery process, the editorial journey, the thrill of seeing a book you believe in take flight. I spoke about Elias's brilliance, his reclusive nature, the collaborative effort of my team. I didn't gloat, I didn't embellish. I simply stated the facts of my professional life, a life that had, until that moment, been largely invisible to this particular audience. The transformation in the room was palpable. The polite, slightly condescending smiles were gone, replaced by expressions of genuine respect, admiration, even a touch of awe. Several of the women, who had barely made eye contact with me earlier, were now leaning forward, hanging on my every word. One of them, a quiet woman named Mrs. Davies, who I later learned was a retired librarian, actually had tears in her eyes. "That's the dream, isn't it?" she whispered. "To find a voice like that, to bring it to the world. How wonderful for you." My mother, meanwhile, was struggling to recalibrate. The initial shock had given way to a flustered attempt to reclaim her role as hostess and knowledgeable matriarch. "Well, yes," she trilled, a little too brightly. "Raven has always been such a clever girl, always loved her books. I knew she had it in her. She never tells me these things in detail. You know how modest she is." I caught Chloe's voice in my head. "Modest? Or you never listened?" I kept my expression neutral. Mrs. Albright, however, wasn't letting her off the hook that easily. "Eleanor, you never told us Raven was such a significant figure. Still trying to make it, you said. Goodness, she's practically running the literary world from behind the scenes." There was a teasing glint in her eye, but the implication was clear. Eleanor had misrepresented her daughter, and quite spectacularly. My mother laughed. A brittle, slightly panicked sound. "Oh, you know, it's all so complicated, this publishing business. I can barely keep up." She tried to steer the conversation back to the tea and scones, but the dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer an appendage, a slightly disappointing enigma. I was Raven McLeod, publisher, the woman who had discovered Elias Thorne. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of excited conversation. The book club members were full of questions, not just about the Obsidian Compass, but about the publishing industry in general. They wanted to know about trends, about how decisions were made, about the challenges and rewards. For the first time, I felt seen by them, not as an extension of my mother, but as an individual with a fascinating and demanding career. It was liberating. The vindication wasn't loud or vengeful, it was a quiet, internal click, the sound of a piece falling perfectly into place. I had simply spoken my truth, and the truth, it turned out, was far more compelling than the fiction my mother had been peddling. As the party began to break up, several of the women approached me individually, pressing their cards into my hand, asking if I might ever speak to their writers' group, or if I could offer advice to a niece who dreamed of getting published. It was a complete reversal. My mother was subdued during the cleanup, her usual brisk efficiency somewhat muted. The drive home, if she'd offered one, or any immediate post-mortem, was avoided as I'd driven myself. Our next phone call a few days later was different, tentative. "Raven," she began, her voice lacking its usual confident cadence. "That was quite something the other day, at the book club." "It was, wasn't it?" I replied, keeping my tone light, neutral. "Why didn't you tell me, dear, about being his publisher? So specifically?" she asked, a hint of her old defensiveness creeping in, but it was weaker now, less assured. "Mom," I said gently, but firmly, "I have told you, many times, about the books I work on, the authors I publish. The Obsidian Compass has been my life for the past year and a half. Perhaps you weren't really listening?" There was a pause, a long one. For a moment, I thought she might argue, might deflect. But then, she surprised me. "Perhaps," she said, her voice very small. "Perhaps I wasn't." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, a crack in the wall of her certainty. It was a start. The news of my outing at the book club spread like wildfire amongst my actual friends and allies. Chloe, when I recounted the story, shrieked with laughter for a full 5 minutes. "Oh my God, Rav, I would have paid good money to see your mother's face. That's poetic justice right there. Mr. Please in Enster.age and at/nh.1. Henderson, whom I called to share the amusing anecdote, just grunted. About time they knew who you were, McLeod. Took 'em long enough. Ben, my partner, just hugged me, a huge, proud smile on his face. That's my Raven, he said, quietly brilliant, until she decides it's time for the fireworks. Interestingly, a few days after the book club, I received an email from Mrs. Davies, the retired librarian. She apologized for the group's initial, somewhat dismissive attitude, blaming it on Eleanor's rather vague introductions over the years. She expressed her profound admiration for my work and asked if I might be willing to look at a manuscript written by her grandniece. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. A new alliance formed, born out of a moment of unexpected truth. It was a reminder that genuine connections can be forged even in the most unlikely of circumstances. The dynamic with my mother didn't magically transform overnight into a perfect, understanding relationship. Years of ingrained patterns don't just vanish, but something had definitely shifted. The power balance felt different. I was no longer the one seeking validation, trying to explain myself. The ball was, for the first time, in her court. She started asking more questions about my work, tentative at first, then with gradually increasing and seemingly genuine interest. She even, to my utter astonishment, bought and read several other books I had published, offering surprisingly insightful comments. She began to refer to me to her friends not as Raven who's trying to make it in books, but as my daughter Raven, the publisher. Sometimes she'd even add, with a touch of newfound pride, "She discovered Elias Thorne, you know." It was a change, a significant one. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of her old self, but the foundation had been altered. I had, inadvertently, forced her to see me, really see me, perhaps for the first time. And in doing so, I realized I didn't need her approval in the same desperate way I once had. My worth wasn't contingent on her understanding it. I knew it. And that, I was beginning to learn, was more than enough. In the years that followed that memorable book club meeting, my career continued to flourish. The Obsidian Compass went on to win several prestigious awards, became an international bestseller, and was even optioned for a film. Elias Thorne, though still reclusive, became a literary icon, and our working relationship deepened into one of mutual respect and trust. I eventually rose to the position of publisher at large at Viridian, with my own imprint, focused on discovering and nurturing unique voices, much like Elias. Life was good. It was busy, demanding, often chaotic, but deeply fulfilling. The quiet satisfaction I felt wasn't just about professional success, it was about a hard-won inner peace. The gnawing need for my mother's specific brand of approval had faded, replaced by a sturdy self-assurance. I was living life on my own terms, defined by my own achievements and my own understanding of what constituted a life well lived. My relationship with my mother evolved, it became more honest. There were still awkward moments, echoes of old patterns, but they were fewer and farther between. She learned to ask rather than assume, to listen rather than dismiss. She started sending me articles about the publishing world, asking my opinion on new books she'd read, ones I hadn't published even. She even, on one memorable occasion, admitted that she'd perhaps been a bit old-fashioned in her views of what constituted a successful career. It wasn't a grand apology, but it was genuine, and for that I was grateful. We found a new equilibrium, one based less on her expectations and more on mutual, if sometimes still slightly bewildered, respect. She might never fully grasp the intricacies of my world, the passion that drove me, but she learned to appreciate the results. And she certainly learned not to introduce me as still trying to make it. The irony, I think, was not lost on her, even if she'd never fully admit it. Sometimes, she'd even boast to new acquaintances, "My daughter Raven, she's quite a big deal in publishing. She discovered Elias Thorne, you know, the one who wrote The Obsidian Compass." I'd just smile. It was a long way from still trying. Looking back on that whole journey, from the girl hiding in books to the woman publishing them, the lessons are clear. The most important one, I think, is about self-worth. For so long I had subconsciously tied my value to my mother's approval, to her understanding of my choices. But true validation doesn't come from those who are unwilling or unable to see you. It comes from within, from knowing your own passion, your own capabilities. It comes from the allies you gather along the way, the Chloes, the Mr. Hendersons, the Bens, who see your light and reflect it back to you. Being underestimated, as frustrating as it was, became a strange kind of fuel. It made me more determined, more focused, more resilient. It taught me that sometimes, the greatest strength comes not from shouting your worth from the rooftops, but from quietly, persistently building it until it becomes undeniable, even to those who were once blind to it. Family is complex. It can be a source of incredible support, but it can also be a source of profound misunderstanding. Learning to set boundaries, to define yourself outside of those familial expectations, is crucial. And sometimes, just sometimes, a well-timed revelation at a suburban book club can be the catalyst for a whole new chapter. So, what about you? Have you ever had a moment like that? A time when you were finally able to show people who you truly are, especially after being misjudged or underestimated? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. We all have these journeys, these moments of quiet triumph or hard-won understanding. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt that need to prove yourself, not for others, but for your own peace of mind, please do give this video a like. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about navigating life's challenges and finding your own voice. Remember, your passion is valid, your path is your own. Don't let anyone dim your light, especially if they're supposed to be holding the lamp for you. Go out there and write your own bestseller, whatever that looks like in your life. Your value is inherent. Believe it. Thanks for listening.